All right, so today we're going to start talking a little bit about development, and I just want to kind of pull an old phrase. This is the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and the first step is by far the most important step on that 1,000 mile journey because it determines what direction you're going to go. And so this is the same conception here that a child's development and growth is a journey of 1,000 miles, and the earliest experiences determine which direction that child is going to develop in. Okay? So we'll talk about here in this first one in particularly how socialization makes differences. So children are essentially born cultureless. All children are born with the potential to be Japanese or whatever. It just depends on they have no culture, right? And so you find that any differences in culture should be strongest with adults because, of course, culture emerges across time, or cultural differences, rather. And so you find that absolutely that has been found. Here in this example, it doesn't even matter what it is. It turns out that Canadian participants and Chinese participants that were 7 years old were quite similar in their responses here. But you can see a difference emerge by age 9, and by age 11, that's how adults look. So it's pretty clear as children are getting more and more experience in their cultural worlds, they're becoming a product of those experiences. We find that a lot of things are enculturated. Cultural practices, belief systems, and the more you have engaged in them, the more they will become habits to you. And so it's kind of sort of like old people are stubborn and don't want to change. Well, I want to kind of describe this as kind of a side of sorts. I mean, it's related, but it's a side of sorts. And that is when it comes to studying language development, you need to understand this conception of a critical period. There's a sensitive window here where language is acquired. And so in this one horrible example, this girl, Jeannie Wiley, she was abused. She was locked in a room. She was given a potty chair. Anytime she tried to talk, she was beaten. And by the time she was discovered at about 13 years old by Child Protective Services, she couldn't talk. And so even though her life improved immensely, if you read the story, it's rather sad, but better than locked in a room with a potty chair, she never gained language. And the idea is that there's a sensitive period somewhere between 1 and 2 years old or so, where if you do not receive linguistic input or language input, you just won't be able to perform the act of language. And so in a classic study here, they took infants, real young infants, and apparently in the Hindi language, they have two different phonemes or sounds for the T sound. So I'm making it up, like in tuh and tuh, something like that. And if you ask English speaking adults, can you tell the difference between tuh and tuh? And they're like, no, I can't tell the difference. And then the bar on the far right here is Hindu speaking adults. And you ask Hindu speaking adults, can you tell the difference between tuh and tuh? And they're like, of course. How could you not hear the difference between those two? Well, what they find using habituation techniques is infants that are in English speaking homes that are between 6 and 8 months can distinguish between tuh and tuh quite well. They do so at like a 90% rate. Once they've become 8 to 10 months old, their ability to discriminate drops to about 60. By the time they get 10 to 12 months, their ability to discriminate is about 15 or 20. It's pretty clear that because they are not being exposed to a distinction between tuh and tuh, they have lost the ability to hear the difference between them. Now, linguistic development is different from cultural development because, of course, linguistic development can be kind of quantified. You can count words and things like this. But culture is a lot harder to quantify. But in this way, people that come to America before age 9 truly feel American, truly American. If they come between around 9 and 15, they're going to sort of have a dual identity. And people that come here after 15 are never really truly able to become American. They just can't quite get it. So we find that there may well be a sensitive period for cultural socialization that is somewhere around this 9 or 10 year old range. Here we have immigrants from Hong Kong to Canada, and you can see at their the blue line is the youngest children that immigrate, and you can see when they immigrate at a young age, the more years they spend in Canada, the more they report identification with Canadian culture, right? You see the orange line and the gray line, which is older immigrants, the more years they spend in Canada, the less that they report identification with Canadian culture. So they become less Canadian with more years in the country if they came in at an older age. Well, similar to this, but kind of off. I actually found this originally when I was teaching a course on social inequality, but it tells me, though the literature I read was from an American outcomes, but there's no reason to believe this isn't true cross culturally. And that is, parents have a vision for what their children are going to become. A parent's job is to prepare their children for to be successful adults. I mean, that's maybe just a pretty brief summarization, but prepare them to be successful adults. And that is to say, I have a vision. Like when my children were little, my assumption was they would be going to college. It was an assumption I made because of my background and experiences. And therefore, I did, in fact, socialize my children in ways that would allow them to be successful in a university environment. I did that from an early age. Okay. Well, in a similar way, parents that are much more working class are much more likely to have things like factory jobs. And so they're probably going to envision my children are going to have a future that is sort of kind of in the ballpark of what I have. And rich parents also have. And so what happens here is they asked mothers, how important is it that your child exhibits this characteristic? How important is it that they exhibit obedience, for example? And you can see that the richest parents are like, no, no. And the poorer parents are much more likely to say, yeah, obedience is important. Some of these other ones scream out, how important is that your child, is happy? And the rich people are like, oh yeah. And the poor people are like, my kid's got to survive, all right? Or honesty, look at that. The poorest families are the ones that are most likely to emphasize honesty as a positive characteristic in their child. And presumably, these emphases or expectations by the parents will differ cross culturally, and through many subtle ways will push children to develop in one way versus another across different cultures.